I just want to make it clear. I think RPE is great, and I use it a lot. But the reliability thing, 100% reliable, not valid.
You realise I'm going to cut this to just that one sentence where you said RPE is great. And because I'm in complete power and control over how this podcast gets edited.
I see.
So yeah, Matt has agreed with my statement, and now
I'm going to continue.
I can spend the next hour sat here smiling. The thing that's good about having read it is that I now have experienced the same collective trauma as about 85% of the population of our generation.
I did watch The Green Mile, which is of similar ilk.
Yeah, I mean, that is also
Is that based on it?
No.
Same concept.
Similar concept.
Just
a giant human.
gentle dude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who ends up dying in the end. Not to ruin it for you guys. Sorry.
It's all right, we'll cut
that. Cool. Should we get into it?
Yes. I don't have a coin again. I've managed to do that again. I'll go grab a coin. That way we don't have to have the whole same panic as last time. I've quadrupled my pension contribution since the last time.
Oh, stop it.
Look at that. It's £2.
Stop it.
£2 coin.
Right, this one is going missing.
You're back.
Okay, now we've got the coin.
Welcome to Performance Proposition.
Welcome to Performance Proposition.
Yeah. Glad we got that out of the way nice and early. So today's talk is about whether or not RPE is the ultimate metric for monitoring or for tracking performance or tracking training. Matt knows a hell of a lot about RPE, so I feel like although realistically it's my turn to do the introduction, it might be better to leave it to your...
As with last week, we covered a topic that is very far-reaching in strength. So, in a similar vein, this week we should probably start by defining what we mean by RPE, both in terms of the scale of RPE that we're using, because obviously there are many, and how we are talking about it in terms of training, whether or not we're talking about it as a prescriptive method or a monitoring method, or whether or not we're talking about it in both contexts. I mean, we'll touch on both contexts, but in terms
do you think it's important to necessarily, we can touch on the different scales, but I don't think it's necessarily that important to talk about which RPE scale we're using.
Well, I mean, it sort of is, because you've got three.
You're talking CR10, CR100 and Borg?
You've got the original Borg one, which is obviously 6 to 20. You got CR10, which is 0 to 10, and then you've got CR100, which is 0 to 100. So, like, in terms of, if people are watching this and thinking, okay, that sounds cool, maybe I want to start using RPE, like, I think it's worthwhile for them and for us, for clarity in terms of what we're talking about, to kind of have an RPE that we would use. Like, if I was going to say to you, which RPE would you use, which one would you use?
I'd go either CR10 or CR100, just because of the fact I think it's easiest for most
100%.
people and most transferable across.
And just to build on that, I'd probably go CR10 if I was prescribing by RPE, and I'd go CR100 if I was monitoring. So there you go. That's the start. Otherwise, we'll sort of I'll touch on the different scales and what that means and stuff, like when we're having the debate. But for now, I just think it's important to clarify that. So what is RPE? RPE is rating of perceived exertion. So it's just a way of essentially an athlete being able to tell you how hard, how difficult they felt the thing that they did was. That can be in the context of a single set, a whole session, a section within the session. It's essentially, you pick a time scale and you say, what was your RPE for that? And obviously if it's a single thing, then it's that thing. If it's a whole set, it's kind of the amalgamation of all the things together. And the beauty of that is it allows us to kind of get an overall idea of how the physiological elements that are encompassed within the things that they're doing have affected them, how intense they found it, the sort of load that they're being placed under by those things. So say you go for a 5k and you rate it an RPE 5 out of 10, the chances are you can probably do the same thing the next day, because it's not going to incur a super amount of fatigue. If you go for a 5k and it's a 9 out of 10, chances are that tomorrow you're probably not going to be able to repeat that for the same output. Yeah, And that's RPE. We're talking about it in the terms of it being the one, the only, the one ring, as it were, for tracking training, right? So Zab, you won the coin toss. Tell me why.
I feel like we should go a little bit further into the explanation first. I just wanted to kind of think about, because I think talking about whether or not we're looking at things from a intra-session perspective, whether we're looking at like the difference between how people are going to perceive their effort within a session versus at the end of a session, looking at things like all of those sorts of factors that we kind of want to talk about a little bit, that's going to give people a bit of a better background. From your experience, what differences have you found and what differences have you seen in the research when you were preparing for your dissertation?
Well, I mean, I don't want to wet my powder, as it were.
Okay, fine. All right.
But no, I will. I mean, so post-session RPE, we know kind of it allows someone to look globally across the session. There's some noise that's introduced, obviously, from you could have had a really fucking tough set of squats that was maybe a 9 out of 10, and then you might have finished with some stretching. So obviously you have proximity bias with RPE, so if you finish with the stretching and then you do your RPE measure, you might get a lower overall rating for the session than if you were to do it immediately after your squats. So you get that fluctuation in RPE across the session. I mean, there's some evidence that it's affected by mood going into the session. Obviously, I mean, you know, anyone that's trained will know if you go into a session feeling shit, the chances are everything's going to feel harder.
Everything's just going to feel heavy and rubbish.
Your brain is like, what the fuck is going on? But if you go in hyped up, that's not a hard and fast rule. If I've gone into sessions hyped up and everything's felt super high, and I've been like, oh God, we're here today, are we? I've gone into sessions feeling shit and everything's felt really, really good. And I'm like, oh, okay, you know, let's go. There's fluctuation, there's variability. It's essentially, I think the key take home with RPE is, unlike things like running speed, percentage 1RM, you know, weights times volume, unlike things like that, it's not objective at all. It's completely subjective. So it's completely unique to the individual in terms of how they perceive what they've
unique
done.
To the individual on the day as well,
On the day.
is like
Exactly.
which is quite a useful tool. The other thing, so in your opinion, I was listening to that podcast that we were talking about earlier, which is it's an episode of the Progress Theory, which we'll put a link to. The guy basically brought up the idea that perceived effort and symptoms of effort are two separate things.
What do you mean when you
So
say
he basically said, like, so he was talking about kind of breathing rate, heart rate, like the physiological things that you would expect to change when you're working hard. And he was saying that in his view, when he's coaching individuals, he tries to get them to separate the sensation of fatigue and their rating of perceived effort or their rating of perceived exertion, and have them as two separate things. Personally, I've never necessarily done because I think that the feedback that you're getting from your body kind of gives you an idea of what your effort is. But I wanted to get your thoughts on that as someone who's used it a lot with.
I mean, it's certainly never something that I did. So like, I mean, I've used it in practice like twice in elite sport environments. So when I was at Scottish Rugby, when I was at Welsh Rugby, big thing, session RPE, collecting it, that sort of stuff. In that environment, it was literally a post-session. How did you rate that session? Out like 0 to 10. Here's the scale. Here's the scale of 10. Like,
here's your really smiley face. Here's your really strained face.
Angry face.
Yeah.
Strained. You know, where did that session sit on that? There wasn't a separation necessarily of like symptoms of fatigue, but then that's probably because when you're looking globally across a session that included squats, bench press, jumps, sprints, all that sorts of stuff, you can't really be like, well, what were my symptoms of fatigue in squats and sprints and things like that? And, you know, it has to be that global. Whereas, like you say, I think that is more a individual training set kind of thing when you're trying to separate that. It sounds like something that would be quite difficult to implement in practice, especially in non-elite populations who don't necessarily have that understanding of symptoms of fatigue and like their own effort, because like, you know, most people don't get it. You know, most people are like, I'm squatting, it feels hard, therefore it's hard. Me and you understand because we've been to that 1RM point like multiple times and we've tested it. We know that after about 80% it starts to feel hard. Probably after about 70% it starts to feel hard.
Yep.
And it feels like oh, I don't think I can go much heavier, and then you put more weight on and you go much heavier.
Yeah.
You just keep putting weight on, and it feels the same amount of hard.
Yeah.
Until it gets to a point where it's almost too hard. And so, like, if you were to ask someone, like, you know, what was your, like, symptoms of effort in the squats, they'd be like, oh, wow, it was a 10, and the RPE was a 10.
Yeah.
Because it was all hard. And I'm like, yeah, but I know you could have.
You could have done more, so therefore,
I've done it with people before where I've been like, we're gonna go up, because I know that you can go up, and I don't think I could lift it. I'm like, we're gonna go up.
Yeah.
You're gonna lift it. And I don't even think I could. They do like 5 reps, and I'm like, okay, cool, we're gonna go up again. And, oh no, definitely not.
Well, it's the same as when you kind of see people. I'm already introducing one of the arguments you're going to make probably, but the whole thing around like how many times you program someone to work at a particular RPE, and then you get them to do an AMRAP set at the end of a training block, and all of a sudden the weight that they thought was an RPE 8 or 9 for 5 reps, they get 15 reps out of it, and you're like, cool, so yeah, that's mildly problematic. But on that note, I will start to think about defending my cause.
Okay.
So basically, the reason that I do think that RPE is probably the most useful.
Ooh, that's not the position.
Yeah,
that's
not the proposition. The reason RPE is the only way that you should ever monitor training performance and and training just generally.
That's better.
Firstly, it's reliable. Like the vast majority of cases, it lines up really, really well with heart rate. It lines up really well with actual percentage of 1RM across multiple studies. Like you see that, especially with more experienced athletes. The second thing is that it's cheap. It's free. Once you've taught someone how to do it, they can do it anywhere, anytime, without any equipment. So they can use that method to track how hard they're working and give themselves an effective understanding of how hard that training session has been and what the training impulse is going to be as a result of that. It's something that can be used across types. So it's not just like using heart rate to track strength training doesn't work. It's only really effective for cardiovascular exercise, whereas using RPE, you can use it for both cardiovascular sessions and strength sessions. Okay, all right, I'm ready. I'm emotionally preparing myself for whatever you're about to say, because I know that's gonna come back and hurt me. And then the other thing that I think is really good about RPE from a programming standpoint is it's a really useful way of auto-regulating intensity based on overall lifestyle stress and overall fatigue, especially if you're someone who trains relatively hard, is following a concurrent training program, or has a relatively busy lifestyle with lots of other responsibilities. So it's really useful for those people to make sure that they're pushing hard enough on a given day, but adjusting in accordance with whatever else is going on. So those are the kind of key arguments I would make in favour of it. I think it's a really useful thing. I think it's free. It's easy enough to use once you get used to it, and it's effective and reliable.
So go again. So it's free.
It's free.
It's effective.
It's effective. It's reliable. It can be used across disciplines, and it's great for auto-regulating when it comes to a programming standpoint.
It's also free to test your 1RM and use a calculator. To figure out percentage 1RM. It's also free to everyone has a smartphone, and guaranteed, granted some people don't, but it's also free to use Strava and track your running pace and things like that. It basically measuring your output, like in the gym, is also free. The only thing that's not free is heart rate monitoring. Like you have to have something to track your heart rate. That's the only thing that wouldn't be free.
And probably some kind of system that would be used to assess bar speed or force plates, things like that can get quite expensive.
But for general population, 100%. Like, I mean, when we're talking about elite populations and training elite athletes, like that stuff is essential anyway. We would probably have that access to that it would just be part of the system. The second point is the reliability thing. Don't disagree. By the way, I just want to make it clear, I think RPE is great and I use it a lot. But the reliability thing, 100% reliable, not valid.
You realise I'm going to cut this to just that one sentence where you said RPE is great, and because I'm in complete power and control over how this podcast gets edited.
I see.
So Matt has agreed with my statement, and now I can spend the next hour sat here smiling.
It's not valid.
It's not valid.
So RPE was created in an endurance environment, right? It was created because it was validated against increases in heart rate. Heart rate. Welcome to the significant version of performance proposition. It was validated against heart rate, and as you jump up the scale, it matched pretty like evenly with increases in heart rate, right? Because obviously, and this is one thing that people might not understand about RPE, is it's not a linear scale. It's not a 0 to 10. Like 5 is not half of 10. 5 is moderate, and then it gets to like slightly hard, very hard, maximal, but it kind of goes like that in the way that heart rate does.
Do you want
as
to do
well.
that for them? Because all that just happened there was you just drew a straight line towards them. Yeah.
So if we go like that, and then it starts to go up. So like you know when you start running, your heart rate doesn't just go up in little 10 beat per minute increments. It kind of goes.
No, my heart rate just goes up by 100 beats per minute straight away. Second I start moving from the couch.
Sounds good.
200 beats per minute.
200 beats per minute.
Everything in life
straight
is
away.
just done at
your whole
RPE,
body's just
RPE
screaming.
I am that 10 face. Just that's me.
That's me all day, every day.
That's how you recognised me when we first met.
But then when they tried to do the same thing with resistance training, it doesn't line up in terms of percentage 1RM, things like that. Like, because I see a lot of coaches using RPE and saying things like, how did that feel on a scale of 1 to 10?
Yes.
Now, I'm always very careful that I'm either using RPE, I either say, what was your rating of perceived exertion? And we've discussed RPE, or I just say, how did that feel on a scale of like 0 to 10? Like, you can't cross those two things because they don't exist in the same place. And like, some people will say, like, people might interpret it as that, but I think it's a good point to get across that it is not validated in a resistance training setting.
There are people that have been doing work to try and get it, to try and find ways to validate it within a resistance training setting. And there are ways that you can make it work, whether that's like using some form of RIR adjustment. You can see that it does line up in those scenarios.
But, and this is the key point, doing those methods make it not so simple, not so cheap in terms of your time. Like, if you're trying to validate, because the only way to adjust it, so I did a lot of like work when I was at Scotland and Wales, again, like trying to like look at, because we used to collect session RPE, right? And that used to be our load measure, and we'd look at that acute versus chronic and stuff, and we'd add together like the resistance training stuff. And like I was doing a lot of work with like exponentially weighting like the training load from the resistance sessions and the running session, like figuring out sort of where they needed to actually sit in terms of the global load, because obviously it wasn't validated at all in that point. And you have to redo that for every individual that you use. Like RPE is great in its simplest form because it covers everyone, right? It's like you say, it's free, it's cheap, it's very, very understandable when you show someone a 0 to 10 scale and you go, happy face, sad face.
Yeah.
Like, this is hard, this is easy. And people get it. But you just have to take it with that little pinch of salt that like, what might be a 7 for one person is a 5 for another, or a 9 for another, right? And that is so variable between people.
Yeah, I can understand that. The other thing that's interesting about RPE is obviously the degree of experience someone has at a particular type of training is going to give them a much better understanding of how to use RPE within that type of training. So like if someone is used to doing endurance style training where grumpy face is heart rate of 180 beats per minute, feeling that they're on the verge of throwing up, maybe they might pass out, maybe they might die. And then they go into a strength training session and all of a sudden an RPE 7, 8 is basically them getting to the end of the set, feeling like they had a couple of reps left in reserve, feeling they want to sit down and eat a chocolate bar for 4 minutes. But actually, that degree of discomfort isn't there. Once they get used to like that style of training, their RPE score for those sessions will become more accurate.
Yes. So, I mean, that's a good point. But again, like, there's a degree of separation between using something and it being immediately useful, and using something and then it becoming useful, like you say, once they get used to it. Because the other thing to mention, and like this is a study that stuck with me from my master's, was when the guy taking the lecture was talking about elite level British like track and field athletes, right? Doing plyometrics, and there's a study that compared them to like normal people doing plyometrics, right? Now normal people doing plyometrics produce maybe like 1.8, 2.5 body weight like forces. The elite guys producing like 7, 8, 9 times body weight forces, right? From an exercise that you come out of being like, oh, it's an RPE 4, 5, I went hard. Like I just jumped high. Yeah. That's all right. Like there's no visceral feelings of fatigue whatsoever, especially when you're doing power stuff and you're doing jump work and things like that. There's no visceral feeling of fatigue. And yet you come in the next day and your nervous system is absolutely fucking shot.
Yeah, I mean it depends on the rep scheme as well.
It depends on the rep scheme,
that, but like
and your actual effort in the session.
And you kind of like you almost get a delayed sense of effort with power
Yeah,
moves. So not like, and I'm not talking like the day after delay. I'm talking like you might jump really high once every 3 minutes and do that. After your 4th or 5th set, all of a sudden you start sweating like a maniac. And you're like, all I've done is jump 5 times. And yeah, you know that you've exerted maximum effort. This podcast we both listened to ahead of this.
It was Sean McKean? Something like that, McKean.
What he was saying in terms of distinguishing effort from sensation. So if you can get to a point where it's like, okay, right, actually, I've put in my maximum degree of effort into trying to jump as high as possible, that's suddenly an RPE 10, even if the feelings or the feedback you got from that aren't giving you the sensation that you've worked at an RPE 10. You know that you went in with the intent to produce maximum force. Yeah. So then all of a sudden it's like, okay, well that now lines up with the training stimulus and the training effect that I'm going to get from that particular thing. Okay, so you've covered reliability and validity. You've covered free.
Now get to the last one, easy.
Well, you've got 2 others. So it was the fact that it can be compared across types, which we kind of covered a little bit, or like it's a useful tool in auto-regulating intensity within a given session based on overall stress.
So, I mean, those last 2 points are true.
Okay, cool.
That's the whole point. That's the reason RPE exists, is because we were kind of looking at it going like, how do we compare a weight session to a skill session to a running session to a speed power session? Like, how do we accumulate that to give us a global measure of like what this person has done in a week?
Yep.
And measure that across time to figure out. So like we were looking at in terms of like injury incidents, so like non-contact soft tissue stuff in rugby. So it was all like, you know, this is the acute load they've had and this is the accumulated chronic load, and does the acute load...
Is there a spike in the acute load way beyond what we would be expecting to be able to cope with from chronic load?
From a chronic perspective, and then is that going to be predictive of injury?
The true definition of load management.
Exactly.
Nice.
We'll leave it there. We'll leave it there. Yeah. True definition of load management.
True definition of load management.
Our RPE is super, super useful for anyone not doing single modality stuff. But equally, even if you're not comparing across modalities, there are still ways to track each modality and keep an eye on that as well. But I will 100% grant, like I think, what RPE does so well is it smooths and simplifies the whole process. It's just like everything that could be affecting you physiologically just squished into this nice little like 0 to 10 scale. And you're like, cool, I get an idea. Like this last week you did this and it was this, and this week you did this and this. But the key but is the only way to distinguish the self-regulation is to track the output. And to know the output. If you're just working on an RPE scale, you have no fucking clue what you've done and when you did it. So like, you know, I don't know what people do when they program and they prescribe by RPE.
I know people that have just used just RPE, and what they do is they say build to a heavy set of 10 at RPE 8 of exercise A. And by doing that, if they continually do that, every single time the person's going to come into the gym, they're going to just build and put weight on the bar until they get to a position where they are working at an RPE 8, which works. It might not be the most effective way, but it's still going to let them work out relatively hard in the same way as if they knew exactly what weight they were lifting but didn't know how hard it felt.
Provided they understand, they understand what an RPE is.
True. Okay, fine.
Right.
Fine.
Because that's what it all comes down to with RPE. Is like the people that use it effectively
are people that know how to use it, but in order to get to a point that you've learned how to use it, you have to have done something else ahead of time. The key question and the argument winner is, if you were only going to track one bit of feedback from your client on the session that you've provided, what bit of feedback would you request?
What bit of feedback would I request?
Like, it would be RPE, wouldn't it? It's not going to... What else would it be?
Well, it depends on the modality. It does.
Okay.
Like,
but I'm saying you're allowed one bit of feedback
for the rest of your life.
From your client, just in general, just at the end of every session, they give you one thing, one quantified.
Do you know what? You're gonna hate me.
And you're just going to be there like, oh well, I'm going to give up on training anyone for cardiovascular benefits from this point forward, and I'm just going to track.
I'm gonna fuck with you big time.
Okay, fine.
Because I'm gonna take something that I know that you do, and I'm gonna put that out there and say, I would ask them if they found it easy, moderate, or hard.
So RPE.
No, it's not RPE.
That is, it's a different.
It's not RPE. RPE is 0 to 10.
No.
CR10 or CR100. I'm gonna ask them if it felt easy, moderate, or hard.
Easy, moderate, or hard is RPE. It's their perceived exertion, regardless of whether or not they've given it a number value of 1 to 10, or 1 to 100, or 6 to 20, or they go very easy, moderate, hard, maximal. That's still, it's a 6-point scale, but it's still based on their perceived effort level.
But it's not RPE as RPE is validated in the literature. And it's not what we defined at the start. I'm being pernickety here.
You are being pernickety because what you know is that is still a way of monitoring RPE. So you're just trying to go, okay, right, I'm not going to use RPE in the way that it's defined and the way that it's validated by the literature. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use your unscientific way of doing it because the fact you know that I'm a genius and I'm better than...
No. Like, I mean, it's funny though, because you say like, that's the argument winning thing. But the proposition at the start is RPE is, what was it?
Is RPE the ultimate?
The ultimate.
And I would say that in itself, like defining it as the ultimate is defining it as if you were going to use one thing, what would it be?
Yeah.
And in my opinion, that has to be.
I mean, the binary way of looking at it is I genuinely don't believe that if you only collected that across time, you would get great results all the time. You might get it like some of the time because again, it's missing context. And I think this is what frustrates me the most.
That's only missing context if you don't know what you've programmed. So if I know that I have programmed a session for an individual and I've said this is the weight you're going to work at, or this is the speed you're going to run at, or this is the...
Well, no, because you said if you can only collect one bit of feedback.
Yeah, I'm only collecting one bit of feedback.
So are we talking about RPE being the ultimate training metric for feedback from a session or prescription for a session? Because, like if we're going with one thing, it's got to either be what weight did you lift? Here's the weight I want you to lift. What weight did you lift? Or here's the RPE I want you to work at. What RPE did you work at?
Here's the weight I want you to lift. What RPE did you experience that as?
If we're being binary with this, it has to stay binary.
It has to stay binary across. It doesn't have to stay binary across.
It has to stay binary across because, like, if we're talking about it being the ultimate training metric for like tracking training, because at the same time, if you're saying I want you to do these weights, them giving you an RPE tells you that the weights that you prescribed were at that RPE. Yes. So you're still getting feedback. You're still getting two types of feedback.
Fine.
So it has to be binary. And in that scenario, I go load external output. I wouldn't program them saying do moderate because I don't.
So you'd ask them how much weight they lifted on their run?
No, but I'm talking like output. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying like, because obviously you can't extrapolate weight lifted in the gym to thing. And so I get what the point you're trying to make here is this one metric to cover it, but we're not talking one metric to rule them all. We're talking, is it external output or internal perception?
Yeah, but external output's going to be monitored in multiple different ways.
But that's still the one metric from them.
How many different variables would you need to know from them based on that to get a measure of that external output?
If I was
weight
coaching
training.
a runner, running speed.
Like
pace.
For how long? For how long?
Average pace. Across a run. What average pace did you achieve? I've programmed it at this average pace because I know that you can run this average pace. What pace did you achieve?
No, I think, like in all fairness, like the argument you're making is absolutely right. Like, there's no point in even trying to work around it because it's just going to make for a shit podcast.
Yeah.
I fully accept what you're saying. Like, I think it's one of those things where I do genuinely believe in the statement that, like, from the perspective of if you were to say what is the most useful tool for monitoring like session feedback from your clients, if you know the weights that they're going to be lifting or they're supposed to be lifting, if you know the speeds they're supposed to be running at, if you've programmed that effectively, getting them to tell you what their RPE was for the session is going to be the most effective way of dealing with it, of dealing with that. And I think, like, one of the things that I do think would be an interesting thing for us to talk about is just how granular you go with that. So whether or not you talk about, so when it comes to finding the training impulse for a session, you could go down the route of going, okay, right, well, you worked at this average RPE for this long, therefore that's your, like, we multiply those two, and that gives us your training impulse. Or you could say, okay, right, this section of the workout, which was 20 minutes in duration, you worked at this RPE.
Yeah.
This section of the workout you did, like, how granular would you go when you're trying to get feedback from?
I would say you have to go global. You
go global. You go session.
Just session.
Okay.
Because it's the same approach I take to, like, everyone shits on like biometrics, like, you know, the scales that use electricity to fucking, you know, tell you how fat you are and how much muscle mass you got. Everyone shits on them because they're like, they're not valid. And you're like, yeah, but they're reliable. Across time, if you turn up in the same conditions, the same amount of hydration, like, the body composition change on there is reliable. Like, you've dropped a kilo and it's picked up, like, the same amount of muscle mass. You've probably lost, like, about that much fat. Like, it's a good way to track it. And it's the same with RPE. It's never going to measure everything you want it to measure. But if you track it across time, like you say, you start to get an idea of, like, a good training impulse for this person for a session. Like, they're usually at a 7. And 7 for them, like, I've got a client, everything is a 7 until it's an 8 or a 9.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
With that client, do you still take into account the duration of the session? So, like, I know that most of your PT sessions are going to be an hour long, but if you were giving them an hour and a half long workout and they were working at an average RPE of 7 for the entirety of that hour and a half, the training impulse is going to be higher than if they were working at an RPE 7 for an hour. Do you account for that when you're thinking about those things, or do you, like?
Yeah, 100%. So, like, again, like, I mean, I don't track training impulse too much these days with clients because I'm not training anyone who is at the level where it would necessarily be a worthwhile pursuit with them. If I was like, I've got a client, I know that they're fucking crushing it, like, day in, day out, like, there's someone that I've got to, like, put the reins on, then I might start doing it. But it's so hard to get people to just engage in that enough to make it worth collecting it. So, like, the only thing I can speak from is the experience I had with, like, Scotland and Wales when I was collecting it from the players post sessions. Yeah. And it would be literally like, end of the weight session, I'd check my watch, I'd be like, okay, cool, that was a 55-minute session. Yeah. They put it as a 9, it was 55 minutes, 9, 55 minutes, 8, 55 minutes, 7, 55 minutes.
And just in terms of how you calculated that, did you apply any kind of, like, quadratic equation to that formula? So was it just 9 times 55, 8 times 55, or was it 9 squared times 55, 8 squared times 55?
9 times 55. So my supervisor at Bath was a guy called Sean Williams, who did a lot of work on what we call exponentially weighted moving averages. And, like, that is, so it's almost like smoothing the data post. So once you collect that, like, so as long as that's how you're collecting it, that's all you need to do. Like, it doesn't need to be any different because then you can process that data. So the one
thing I found interesting, and so the reason I use my 6-point scale is because of the fact I think it lines up really nicely across different modalities, because of the fact, like, quite often you'll have, like, zones 1 to 6, maybe 1 to 7 in cardio, but maybe 1 to 5 in cardio, but, like, it will be pretty closely lined up to, like, a 1 to 6 scale in terms of weight training. And even when you look at, like, the 0 to 10 scale, like, there are only really 6 levels to that 0 to 10 scale, in spite of the fact, like, they can, but one of the things that, obviously, when it comes to kind of calculating TRIMP scores in cardiovascular training, they monitor the amount of time spent in each zone, but then they don't just go, okay, right, you've spent 30 minutes in zone 3, therefore it's 3 times 30 minutes. They go 3 cubed times 30 minutes, 5 cubed times 30 minutes, because it reflects what we were saying earlier about the fact that RPE is exponential.
Right. But then RPE does that for you, essentially. If you're collecting an average RPE and you're like, what's the stimulus? Like, you know, if that's the idea behind RPE, is to get, like, a global interaction of all the factors, all the zones that you've been in, the time that you spent in the zones, and, like, the outcome of that to that person. Yeah. Like, you track that across time and you just keep tracking it as you're tracking it. Like, if you start by cubing it, always cube it. Never don't cube it. If you start not cubing it, always don't cube it. You know what I mean? Like, with RPE, like, the beauty of it is what makes it so effective in the simplicity. And the second you start trying to go beyond that, when you're trying to, like, calculate things, like I say, once you get your training load, i.e. your session RPE, and you're adding that all up, and you're trying to create, like, averages of chronic and acute workload and shit like that, then you can start doing whatever the fuck you want with that data, because you can process it to the nth degree and smooth it and make it all lovely and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I sit with it, because I just feel like so many times when I was like trying to figure like this stuff out, like the more complex you try and go, the harder it becomes to sustain. And the beauty of this thing in of itself is like the longevity, like the fact that it stays as that across years and decades of, and it allows that consistent level of how are you feeling forever. So it has to stay consistent as data, because once you start collecting it differently, all that chronic stuff becomes useless.
Yeah, fair enough.
Because it's not usable. So the more you simplify it, the easier your life becomes across time.
I mean, it's an extra line in an Excel sheet, just to be clear. That like if you're going to cube it, or you're going to square it, or you're going to do whatever, it's only. But like once you've done it, once you've made your decision about how you're going to collect
exactly.
it, I can.
Just
because otherwise it's just
if you're like, this person, I'm going to cube it, and this person did this particular modality, so I'm going to times it by 2.5. It's all.
One of the things that's really useful about RPE is obviously the fact that it applies across modalities, and it gives you an overall training stress for a given day, an overall training load for a given day, quite accurately for lots of different disciplines and lots of different training types. Do you still divide up your workload by type? Or would you still divide up your workload by type with the athletes that you're training, and how important
What do you
think?
mean?
So
divide up.
So normally that you go, okay, right. Well, this is the session duration, this is the session type, this is the RPE for the session. Do you then apply a training load to each given type, or do you think about it globally again in that sense of like, okay, right. Well, actually, we're just going to look at training load across all types of training?
So my whole approach to training these days is I probably don't use RPE as much as I used to. Not in the sense that like I don't collect it post session and I don't prescribe off it a lot. What I do is I figure out what I want from the session. Like if it's a strength session, like do I want them working above 85%, below 85%? Am I looking for volume? Am I looking for intensity? Like same with the running stuff. Like, do I want them running fast? Do I want them running slow? Is this tempos? Is this whatever? And once I've made that decision about the physiological adaptation I'm looking for from a session, then if I've got them in person, I will, like after every set when they're warming up and stuff, I will use RPE as an auto regulator by being like, how did that set feel? And then again, I'm not using RPE. I'm just saying, how did that set feel?
How did that set feel?
Out of 10.
Out of 10.
And like I said, I've got a client. It's always 7. And the second it gets to a 7.5, I know it's about to be an 8, a 9, a 9.5.
Yeah.
And so I know that like that's my point to stop and let him have a couple of sets there to see how he copes. And then if he's still there, I'm like, cool, now we can push it. I've got another client who like sits very much on the like the linear side. Is like, how is that? Like first warm up, like a 3 or a 4. Okay, how is that? 4 or 5? How is that? 6 or a 7? And I know that like I'm looking for them to be at about an 8.
Yeah.
So I know that I can keep building. And I just have that kind of constant communication with the client. So I use it to auto-regulate without communicating. The times I use it, not like that, is when I have new clients or online clients that I don't know what their lifts are. I don't know how they're doing. And so I then try and use a bit of RPE to kind of be like, get to that, record your weights, we'll see where you get to. And then once I've got an idea of like, cool, most of the time their 8 out of 10 is this, which allows me to then go, so we're probably talking a 1RM of around this. So if I prescribe them this way and then ask them for feedback on how it is, cool, I've then got an idea of like the load. Because I mean, I've always been a super data oriented mind. That's how I work. I mean, I've got this little spreadsheet that's like, 1 to 12 reps.
That's what you're going to talk about, your spreadsheet about your day, just how well organised that is. But
no. That's not well organised at all. But no, you have them percentages like 100%, 90, 80, and then it kind of crosses over and it tells you, so that's like percentage effort. Yeah. And then the percentage that you need to program at of their 1RM to elicit a 75% effort for 5 reps. So if I'm doing 5 reps for a 75% effort, I'm like, cool, I want to be at 70% for 5 reps because that elicits a 75% effort. And then when I program, I like try and move up that scale towards 95% to finish like a peak.
Yep.
But you never go to 100% unless you're testing.
So you've got your spreadsheet full of data saying this is their 1 rep max, this is what 90% of their 1 rep max would be, this is what 80% of their 1 rep max should be, this is what 70% of their 1 rep max should be. I think it's quite an interesting thing now for us to basically talk about how you'd use that to kind of auto-regulate using RPE. Like, so if you were saying, okay, I want this individual to, so either from a tracking perspective, if they give you feedback that says that a weight that should have felt like 80% actually felt like 90%, then that tells you that they are coming into the session either too fatigued or they've got a lot of stress going on. And if that's happening really regularly, then you probably need to make some adjustment or go into a bit of a deload phase for that individual. And similarly, if you do the reverse and you program by prescribing an RPE and they work up to a given weight that isn't close to what you expected them to hit at the RPE, either you need to tell them to buck their ideas off, work that a little bit harder, or establish whether or not, again, they're coming in overtrained, they're coming in tired, whether something needs to change in terms of your program.
So what I'll always try and do is I'll always try and program percentage ranges rather than set. You're working at 87.5% this week, and there is no adjustment, there is no fluctuation within that. Again, like, you know, I'll look at it and I'll be like, cool, so it's week 1, I want them somewhere between 65 and 75% effort, which puts them between these 2 percentage ranges. And then, as long as I have good communication with them, I'm like, look, if the first set at that, for fucking hard, stay there. And stay there for a couple of sets and then increase it if you feel like it's getting better or it stays the same and like nothing changes and it doesn't feel any more hard or any less hard, then increase. If it starts feeling harder, definitely stay where you are. If it starts feeling easier, increase. And just as long as they're working in that, I know that they're getting the stimulus that I want them to get. In terms of like a chronic fatigue thing, again, like if I was in a performance environment, I would be collecting energy source. I tried doing this with my clients for a long time and no one engaged because like people just, they haven't got time, they don't understand it, they haven't got time. Like I tried my best to explain it to them, but...
So were you just doing like a well-being questionnaire on a day-to-day basis? Or
just getting them to fill in like, you know, a 0 to 10 or a 0 to 5, whichever one worked better for them. Like, you know, how sore are you this morning? How energetic are you? What was your sleep quality like? That sort of stuff. And like, look at that. And look at their output. And then you'd be like, okay, these things are crossing over, let's have a conversation. Okay, it's pretty acute, like you just had a couple of bad nights of sleep. That's fine, let's pull back and then go hard again. Or it's like, oh shit, your sleep quality started here and is like there now. And so clearly there's a more systemic issue underneath this. So let's pull the training back for a little bit, work to speed. So like that's always my big regulator. If people are feeling a little bit fatigued, I always just go back to velocity stuff. And I'm like, this is the best way to get you out of this hole, because like if you can't move it quickly, you can't go up. And so, but then wherever you're at, you're getting a stimulus above the weight that's going on because you're moving it
as fast
quickly, as fast as you possibly can.
What if that in itself is the thing that feels overloaded for that individual? So like, if you train someone who is a sprinter and you get them sprinting a lot, their main training load is going to be geared towards velocity work. If all of a sudden that individual comes in tired, and then you're like, okay, right, we're just going to focus on speed work, you're still overloading the same system. So if you've got someone who is dealing with like quite a high degree of like who is overtrained, it's about understanding which system's been taxed excessively and which this system therefore needs a rest. And not
but even then, even with a sprinter, I don't think it's speed that's being overloaded in that sense. Like if they're coming in tired, like I said to you, like they're producing force relative to the ground in excess of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times body weight sometimes, right? So like no fucking reactive work with them. I'm just talking like speed on the bar. And I'm talking about a speed where they can move away and it just moves quickly and it doesn't slow down. Because again, we know that bar speed correlates perfectly, near enough, with reps away from failure. And
so long as you are intending on moving the bar as quickly as possible.
Exactly. And you can see it happen. And like I see it like with a lot of clients, I can tell. I'm like, cool, I know that you need to stop there. Because the next one is going to be worse, and then the next one you're probably going to fail. So I can see that you're 2 reps away from fatigue. I can just see it happen in the bar. And like that for me is an even more potent auto-regulator than even like saying to them to work at an RPE 8, because it's an output, and as long as like you're telling them and they're trying to work as hard as they can.
Yeah.
Right.
If that again,
the only thing
is they're working as hard as they can, because if they're not working as hard as they can, like the bar might slow down because of the fact they're not necessarily applying. Like,
but the way you get past that, and the way I always get past that, is you just like, if the bar starts to slow down, you say push it as hard as you can, like straight away. As soon as you see that bar slowing, like go fucking hard, and the next one is usually, and you're like, okay, cool, so you're not close. And then when it starts to slow down again, you say go fucking hard. You go like every time, and then when it's like starts to slow down and you tell them and you're like go hard, like come on, let's move it fast. And the next one they're trying to move it fast and you can see they're slow. You're like cool, that's where I know they're at. Like sometimes it's not like people don't have that understanding of like keeping moving it hard. They kind of forget they're just a bit lazy. They're not really that engaged. And it just takes you as a coach just like literally like one word, just faster. And if they can't do it, then you just have to be like, yeah, cool. Because they can't hide that from you. No matter how difficult they tell you it is, they can't hide that. Like I said, I had guys doing like when I do like 8 RM tests and they'd get 15 reps. Because I'd be stood behind them being like, one more. And they're like, but I'm fucked. I'm like, mate, the bar is flying. I don't care how you feel, the bar is flying.
And then you get that one client who that doesn't actually correlate whatsoever with their ability, and they get stuck at the bottom of a rep, and you're like, you really work.
I don't understand how you were able to move that last rep so quickly, and then the next one was just nothing.
Yeah. The next rep moves quickly, but just downwards. That's the worst sensation when that happens. When you just you think you're about to push, and then it's just like it goes the other way.
Ooh. Yeah. Cool. Should we wrap up, or do we feel like we haven't?
I feel like the thing we need to kind of go through now. So like, realistically, let's just wrap up. But it's what would you, having had this conversation, obviously you personally would collect as much data as you possibly can. Like that's fundamentally like if you're coaching, like the more data you have, the better equipped you're going to be at making decisions about your programming moving forwards, understanding what's going on with your client on a given day, etc. So gather as much data as you can, but what would you say are your kind of 5 key things that you would gather if you had the capacity and if you had the perfect client that was going to give you all the feedback in the world?
So some measure of wellness, whether or not that's a super compressed, like how do you feel this morning? Or if it's like a energy, sauna, sleep quality, length, like all broken down into different bits, whichever way that comes, 100% track that, because although RPE can account for that, it doesn't give you the context. It doesn't tell you where it's coming from.
The RPE will also regulate, but you don't know what you're also regulating.
I would track session RPE. I would track external output in a session. So like I said, whatever your goal with that session is, that's what you're tracking. If it's a power session, if it's a jump session, you track jump height. If it's a speed session, you track 10 meter time, 20 meter time, time to complete drill. If it's a strength session, you collect weight lifted. If it's a running session, you collect like time spent in zone, running speed, like whatever you want to collect, that external output. So you then got
power zone or heart rate zone, realistically.
You've then got how does that person feel generally? How did they perceive the effort in that session? What was the actual effort in that session? And then those 3 things all interact to create like an idea of like how like what is causing any fluctuations in anything. And to be honest with you, I mean, you said 5. I'm trying to think of another 2 more because you said 5. To be honest with you, I keep it there.
That is enough, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
Like you included heart rate zone, power zone for cardiovascular training, weight lifted, reps performed. For strength training and jump height / bar speed, speed of movement for power training within one category. So I would just basically put them across 3 categories. And I'd just say for me, the thing that I like about RPE, and I think RPE is great as that kind of final stage. So like having all of those metrics, the more of the other metrics you have, the better. and RPE is just going to help you to. It's the overarching thing for all of them, because it tells you, okay, right, actually, I know this person was supposed to work this hard. This is how hard they worked. This is how hard they felt like they worked. What does that tell me about their ability to perform, how they responded to their training plan, how fatigued they are, etc. When we need to deload, when we need to
And I think the key
push.
final point to make before we wrap up is RPE is fantastic, and it is an excellent way to measure and in some cases prescribe training. But if it's the only thing that you use, you are completely missing the point of it. Because there is no way to know what the changes in that are and what they're reflecting. And I know that most people who only use RPE still also track weight, but they talk about it like you should only track RPE. And I think what we just have to recognize as coaches, and I think this is so true across so many things, is our understanding of these things and the way that we put it across to people on platforms like Instagram and Twitter and other things like that. When we're talking to people and we're saying, do this thing, we have to be very careful about like what we say to people, because essentially those people won't understand that there's context behind that. And I think that's the key message to end on, is like, RP is fantastic, but you have to track output to understand it. Cool.
I'm slightly annoyed because of the fact we didn't cover RPE shift and we didn't cover the difference between relative and absolute RPE in the whole concept of reps in reserve versus, like, you could say, oh well, I'm applying maximum, like 50% of maximum effort, and that is literally 50% of your 1 rep max. Or you could say, I'm applying 50% of maximum effort, and that means that you are doing your 2 rep max for 1 rep, and that's relative. And I think that's like that. Both of those are kind of interesting things, but
just for context though, like 50% of max effort, like my max squat at the moment is like 180. Predicted at 192, but like 180. A squat at 90 kilos is not a 5 out of 10 RP for me. That's like a 2 out of 10 RP.
but this is kind of the difference. So that is that's you defining it as relative versus absolute. Because it's 50% of maximum effort. It is a 50% absolute effort. And it's one of the things which kind of like causes the lack of crossover between
weight training,
training and cardiovascular training.
That's why it's logarithmic though. That's why RP is logarithmic, because 50% isn't 50%. Like if you look at an RP scale, it's 0 is nothing, and then 5 is like easy. And then 7 is moderate. And then 8 is hard. 9 is very hard, and 10 is maximal. And that, for me, like the scale itself actually very cleverly accounts for the drift in set. As long as you remember that. As long as, this is why it's so important that if you do collect RPE with the clients, that's probably something else to say. If you want to actually collect RPE and you want to do it the way that it's intended, you have to have a numbers and pictures and descriptions scale. You can't just say, how did you feel out of 10? Because they're going to assume that 1 is easy, 2 is slightly easy, 3 is a little bit more difficult, 4 is the, 5 is the, do you know what I mean? They're going to assume that it just tracks like everything else that they do tracks. Whereas in reality, they're going to look at it and the visual prompts, like you said, it's only actually 6 points because they're the points that they highlight to show that. Boom, 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 boom.
The drift thing, it comes down to whether or not you start a set. With weight training, it's impossible to realistically account for drift. With heart rate and with cardiovascular training, it's interesting to see whether or not you account for drift, because of the fact you're thinking about, okay, right, I'm going to try and get to the end of this 4-minute interval, and the 4-minute interval is supposed to be an RPE 7, and I want to maintain a steady watt output for the entirety of that interval. So if you're in the position where it's like, okay, right, well, I know that I want to finish this at an RPE 7, you need to start at an RPE 5 to account for the fact that it's going to finish at an RPE 7.
Well, mate, I experienced it in my training today. I had 12 sets of 500 meters and stayed below 140 for the whole time.
What, on a row?
On a row,
nice.
Right? And like, I started at a 214. I finished at like a 227. So like, the effort was the same, the output was different into the rower. To keep my heart rate where it was, and to stop me drifting into like the higher ends of the RP, because I knew that it had to feel easy and it had to be under 140. It didn't have to, but it was like a try to, and I took it. I'm weird like that. If it says under 140, it has to be.
It has to be under 140. I wouldn't expect it to be any other way.
So like, and I try not to look at the output because otherwise I get like, oh, that was 214. I need to be at 214. So I have to keep my eye on the heart rate. And so keeping yourself there, like you say, it shows that like if you want to maintain a consistent RPE across a set, you have to measure output. You have to moderate output. You have to reduce it sometimes. So that the RPE remains consistent. Otherwise, it's not going to remain consistent. It's going to go up, approaching failure. And we know that it linearly correlates with closer to failure, higher RPE, as is to be expected. Cool.
Okay, so you said you've got the proposition for next week. What is the proposition for next week?
Can I remember it? That is the question. So we talked today about RPE difficulty within those lines. Glass backs.
That was your statement. Yeah.
That was. So.
Is it always? It's always safe.
It is always safe to lift with a rounded spine.
Where do you sit on it at the moment?
Where do I sit on it at the moment? I sit on it that, as with everything I sit on, is contextually important. Good posture. I think there are incidences where it is not optimal and not safe, and there are many incidences where it can be and is. But as is my nature, there is no black and white. But that is not the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is to be black and white and reveal the grey.
Here is a coin.
Okay. So, is this to...
Heads you defend, tails I defend.
Okay.
I think I defend. Oh, heads you defend.
It's always safe to lift with a rounded back.
There you go, sir. It's always safe to lift with a rounded back. You need to spend a little bit of time talking to Sam over the course of this week.
Yes.
Just look at Sam, look at Alec Bennis, look at Angus Bradley. So how many other
I just need to go and be like,
can we name?
So, what is good about lifting with a rounded back? Tell me. Always. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe I should also watch some Squat University, just for balance.
No. I'll watch Squat University.
Yeah, I'll watch that, and then we'll just like rehash both of their arguments at each other.
We'll just make it really shouty next week.
Yeah. Fuck you, you stupid glass back prick.
Fuck you, meathead.
My spine can take the weight of an entire generation, man. I am a primal athlete.
You can handle the weight of revolution. Oh, cool. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure as ever.
It has.
Yeah. Looking forward to next week. I think.
I would call that a draw again.
You call it a draw?
Yeah, I call it a draw. Because I did concede that, like.
In all fairness, when I cut it, I won. And I'm going to cut it to that 1 minute.
You are correct. And you got points as well.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Done.
Awesome.